The air above the Pacific shimmered with heat and silence, the kind of silence that hides storms. In early 1942, the world was burning. Europe was locked in the iron grip of Hitler, North Africa roared with tanks and sandstorms, and across the Pacific, Japan's red sun was rising higher with every victory. The oceans no longer felt safe, and the sky belonged to whoever carried more courage or more planes. Far away from the Western Front, a quiet chain of islands known as the Coral Sea was about to become the stage for something the world had never seen before, a battle where men would fight and die without ever seeing their enemies face to face. Just a few months earlier, in December 1941, Japan had stunned the world by attacking Pearl Harbor. The explosions still echoed in the minds of every American sailor who had watched his ship burn under the Hawaiian sun. That attack had done more than sink ships, it had awakened the sleeping giant. The United States, which had tried to stay out of the war, was now fully inside it. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's promise to defend freedom was no longer just words on a radio broadcast, it was steel, fire, and resolve sailing across the ocean. Japan, confident and bold, had been unstoppable since Pearl Harbor. Their empire stretched from the jungles of Burma to the islands of the Philippines, from the beaches of Malaya to the blue waters of the South Pacific. Their dream was simple: control the Pacific Ocean, cut off Australia from American support, and force the Allies into submission. To do that, they needed to capture Port Moresby, a coastal city in Papua New Guinea. Once Port Moresby was in Japanese hands, Australia would be vulnerable to attack, and the southern hemisphere would bow to the empire of the rising sun. But the Japanese didn't know that their secret plans weren't as secret as they believed. Deep inside a small room in Pearl Harbor, American code breakers had cracked Japan's communication codes. They had intercepted messages hinting at a major offensive in the Coral Sea region. The Americans didn't know the exact details, but they knew enough. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, decided to act fast. He gathered what he could: 2 aircraft carriers, USS Lexington and USS Yorktown, and a handful of cruisers and destroyers. They were outnumbered, but the element of surprise was now in American hands. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, Japanese Admiral Shigeyoshi Inu was already preparing his strike. His forces included the carriers Shokaku, Ziwakaku, and the smaller Shiho, along with a strong escort fleet. His plan was to invade Tulagi and then move south toward Port Moresby. The Japanese believed the Americans were too far away to interfere. They were wrong. In the first days of May 1942, the ocean began to fill with ships moving like ghosts. From the decks of the American carriers, young pilots looked out across endless blue, knowing that somewhere beyond the horizon, another fleet was searching for them. The days were long, filled with tension, waiting, and training. Mechanics worked non-stop, arming planes and checking engines, while radar operators scanned the skies for the first sign of movement. Every sound, the creak of steel, the hum of the wind, felt like a heartbeat before battle. Far below, in Australia, people lived in quiet fear. Japanese planes had already bombed the northern city of Darwin earlier that year. Rumors spread fast: "They're coming for us next." Newspapers printed stories of bravery and loss. Mothers whispered prayers, and soldiers trained on dusty fields, their rifles glinting under the harsh sun. The war that once felt distant was now at their doorstep. On May 3, 1942, the Japanese invaded Tulagi, a small island in the Solomon Chain. American scouts spotted them, and the message flashed across the Pacific to Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, commander of the U.S. Task Force. He didn't hesitate. "Launch the planes," he ordered. The next morning, American aircraft soared over Tulagi and rained destruction on the Japanese ships below. The attack sank several small vessels, surprising the enemy, but it also told Japan something important: the Americans were here. The sea, once thought empty, was now a battleground. Both sides began searching for each other, sending out reconnaissance planes in widening circles. The ocean seemed endless, but every cloud, every shadow, could hide death. Sometimes pilots flew for hours, scanning waves that all looked the same. Some never returned. The tension on the carriers was unbearable, sleep came in short bursts, and food had no taste. Everyone knew that the moment the enemy was found, chaos would erupt. For the sailors aboard the USS Lexington, nicknamed Lady Lex, life had become a strange rhythm of fear and routine. Letters from home were read and reread until the ink faded. Photographs of sweethearts were tucked under pillows. The smell of fuel, sweat, and salt filled the air. Yet, despite the fear, there was pride, a belief that they were the first line of defense between Japan and Australia. The Japanese fleet, too, moved silently through the Coral Sea. Their pilots were experienced, their ships well armed, their discipline legendary. But even among them, whispers of doubt began to spread. The Americans had proven unpredictable, and the Pacific was vast enough to hide anything, even fate. As May 4th turned to May 5th, and then May 6th, the weather grew rougher. Rain clouds rolled in, and the wind howled across the decks. It felt as if nature itself was holding its breath. Somewhere beyond those clouds, the two greatest naval powers of the age were closing in on each other, unaware that they were about to make history. That night, under a moon half hidden by clouds, the sea glowed faintly with the light of phosphorescent plankton. Sailors leaned on railings, smoking cigarettes, staring into the darkness. Some joked nervously. Others prayed. Above them, in the captain's quarters, maps were spread across tables, radios crackled with coded messages, and commanders whispered over the hum of engines. They knew tomorrow could decide everything. The Battle of the Coral Sea wasn't just about ships or islands. It was about ideas, the idea of control, of courage, of survival. It was about a new kind of war, one fought from the skies, where a single pilot could decide the fate of 1,000 men. No one knew how it would end. But everyone aboard those ships felt it in their bones: history was only hours away. As dawn began to break on May 7, 1942, a thin orange line appeared over the horizon. The first aircraft engines roared to life, propellers slicing through the mist. The sky trembled with the sound of warplanes taking off one after another, each carrying bombs, torpedoes, and the hopes of their nations. The calm of the Coral Sea shattered, replaced by the echo of wings and war cries. Somewhere in that vast expanse of ocean, the enemy waited, and for the first time in human history, men would fight a naval battle without ever seeing each other. The battle begins. The morning of May 4, 1942, arrived quietly, the sea lying still under a thin veil of cloud. But on the decks of the American carrier Yorktown, there was no peace. Mechanics were already drenched in sweat before the sun had fully risen, preparing aircraft for takeoff. The smell of aviation fuel hung thick in the air as pilots fastened their flight suits, their helmets reflecting the dull glow of dawn. They were young, some barely 20, and yet, in the next few hours, they would carry the weight of history on their shoulders. Orders had come from Admiral Fletcher: the Japanese were attacking Tulagi, and it was time to strike back. At precisely 0700 hours, the first planes lifted from the deck. The sound was deafening: engines roaring, wind howling past open cockpits, the carriers trembling under the power of each launch. From above, The Pacific looked endless, a moving carpet of blue, dotted with shadows of clouds and white trails of foam. The pilots flew low at first, then climbed into the sun, where the horizon blurred between sky and water. Somewhere ahead lay the Japanese invasion fleet. When they reached Tulagi, the island was alive with enemy activity: barges unloading men, destroyers patrolling, planes on the airstrip preparing to take off. The American pilots wasted no time. They dived from the clouds, their bombs slicing through the air like falling stars. Explosions tore across the harbor. Flames leapt from the decks of Japanese ships. The attack was swift, brutal, and unexpected. By the time the Americans turned back, they had sunk several enemy vessels, crippled a destroyer, and left the island shrouded in smoke. Back on the carriers, the mood was electric. News of the successful strike spread through the fleet like wildfire. Men who had been silent for days were suddenly laughing, shaking hands, slapping backs. It wasn't a major victory, but it was proof the Japanese could be hurt. Yet even as the cheers faded, officers on the bridge remained tense. Tulagi was only the beginning. The main Japanese force, the one carrying the powerful carriers Shokaku and Ziwikaku, was still somewhere out there, hidden beyond hundreds of miles of ocean. Over the next 2 days, both sides began a deadly game of hide and seek. Aircraft launched at dawn, fanning out in every direction, scanning the sea for signs of the enemy. The sky belonged to the scouts now. For hours, they flew over empty water, eyes straining against glare, looking for anything that moved: an oil slick, a shadow, the glint of sunlight on steel. Every report that came crackling through the radio could mean the difference between life and death. On May 6, a single mistake nearly changed everything. A Japanese reconnaissance plane spotted what it thought was an American carrier group. The report went back to the fleet, but the coordinates were wrong: it was a decoy force. Japanese Admiral Takagi, convinced he had found the enemy, launched a massive airstrike. The planes soared into the sky and vanished into the haze, never finding their target. Hours later, many returned with empty fuel tanks, forced to ditch into the sea. The Americans never even saw them. It was a small stroke of luck, but luck in war often decides fate. That same day, on Lexington, a young radio operator named James Red Whitaker sat in the communications room, headphones clamped to his ears, listening to the endless static of enemy chatter. His hands shook slightly as he took notes. He had been at Pearl Harbor 5 months ago, had watched flames swallow his friends. Now, he was listening for revenge. Every faint signal from Japanese aircraft, every intercepted code, meant another chance to strike first. Outside, the ship's siren wailed: flight operations resuming. The moment of calm was gone again. By the afternoon, the sea began to change. A warm wind picked up, and the skies turned gray. Squalls rolled in from the east, rain pelting the decks. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. For the sailors, the storm was both a curse and a blessing. It hid them from enemy eyes, but it also blinded their own. The carrier's deck became slick and dangerous. Crews tied down planes with thick ropes as the ship pitched and rolled. Every wave felt like the breath of an unseen giant. Below deck, in the mess hall, the men tried to eat, though few had an appetite. Conversations drifted in hushed tones. Some talked about home: California, Kansas, or small towns they might never see again. Others cleaned their weapons in silence. On the wall, someone had chalked a phrase, *, next stop Tokyo. *, it was meant as a joke, but the room stayed quiet after reading it. Night fell quickly that day. The storm passed, leaving the sea eerily calm again. The stars came out, bright and indifferent to the war unfolding beneath them. On the bridge, Admiral Fletcher leaned over a map, tracing positions with his finger. He knew the enemy was close. Both fleets were circling in the dark, searching, waiting for daylight to bring clarity and death. At 10 p.m., a coded message arrived from the reconnaissance team. They had picked up faint signals of Japanese carrier planes heading south. Fletcher's eyes narrowed. That meant the main Japanese carriers couldn't be far. He gave the order, prepare to launch at dawn. All night, the carriers buzzed with activity. Mechanics loaded bombs, torpedoes, and ammunition. Pilots tried to sleep on the hangar floor, helmets under their heads, the hum of engines lulling them into uneasy dreams. Somewhere across the sea, on the Shokaku, Japanese pilots were doing the same. Their commander, Admiral Takagi, studied his own maps under the dim light of a lantern. He knew the Americans had been at Tulagi, and he suspected another strike was coming. But he underestimated how close they were. Tomorrow, he told his men, we end the threat to Port Moresby. Outside, the deck crew bowed their heads before the rising sun flag, whispering prayers to ancestors. In the distance, lightning flashed like a warning. The early hours of May 7 crept in with a faint mist hanging over the sea. The carriers cut through it like silent beasts, their wakes glowing faintly in the dark. No one spoke much anymore. Every man aboard those ships knew what was coming. By sunrise, both sides would find each other, and the Coral Sea would erupt in fire. For now, there was only the rhythm of the waves, the heartbeat of engines, and the heavy breath of the ocean waiting. The hunters were closing in, unaware that they were also being hunted. In a few hours, the world would witness something entirely new: aircraft, not cannons, deciding the fate of nations. But in that final quiet before the storm, the Pacific held its secret close, as if testing which side deserved to survive the coming dawn. The search was almost over. The first true clash was about to begin. Fire on the sea. Dawn broke on May 7, 1942, with the sky painted in streaks of orange and gray. The sea was calm, deceptively calm, as if holding its breath before chaos erupted. On the decks of the Lexington and Yorktown, men moved quickly and silently. The engines of the aircraft thundered to life one by one, the vibrations running through the entire ship. Every face showed the same mix of fear and determination. No one knew what the day would bring, but everyone understood that it would be remembered. Just after sunrise, American scouts took off to locate the Japanese fleet. The horizon was empty at first, then a report came crackling through the radio: an enemy carrier spotted north of Misima Island. Admiral Fletcher didn't hesitate. Launch all available aircraft, he ordered. Within minutes, waves of dive bombers and torpedo planes were roaring into the sky, their wings glinting in the morning light. High above the Pacific, the air grew tense. The pilots scanned the ocean below, their eyes burning against the sun's glare. Then, far ahead, they saw a dark smudge on the horizon that soon became the outline of a Japanese carrier. It was the Shaho, a light carrier protecting the invasion fleet. The Americans spread out, circling like hawks. The attack began at 1100 hours. From above the clouds, American bombers dived steeply, sirens screaming as they fell toward their target. The Japanese ships below exploded into motion, anti-aircraft guns blazing, black smoke curling into the sky. But the sea was soon covered in fire and chaos. Bombs hit the Shaho's deck, ripping through steel and sending fuel spraying in all directions. 1, 2, 3 torpedoes struck the hull, lifting the carrier out of the water for a heartbeat before it began to sink. Flames consumed the deck, and sailors leapt into the ocean as the ship rolled onto its side. From the cockpit of his plane, Lieutenant Commander Robert Dixon watched it all unfold. He grabbed his radio and shouted into it, his voice shaking with adrenaline, "Scratch one flat top." It became the most famous message of the battle, a declaration that the tide was beginning to turn. The Shaho was gone within minutes, disappearing beneath waves still boiling from the fire. But the victory was not without cost. Several American planes were hit during the attack, bursting into flames and spiraling into the sea. Those who survived the mission returned to their carriers in silence, their faces marked by exhaustion and shock. On deck, mechanics pulled them out of cockpits, some trembling, some bleeding. They had struck hard, but everyone knew the main Japanese force was still out there. As night fell, the ocean seemed to swallow the sky. The stars flickered faintly, reflected in waves that hid both wreckage and bodies. Both sides spent the night preparing for what they knew would be a final confrontation. On the American carriers, the men slept in their clothes, ready to run at the first alarm. On the Japanese ships, sailors prayed in the dark, their faith mingling with the smell of oil and smoke. The commanders on both sides were planning the same thing: destroy the enemy at dawn. May 8, 1942, Day 2 of fire. The morning light revealed a restless sea and a thin layer of mist. Radar screens flickered, aircraft warmed up on both sides. At 0900 hours, almost simultaneously, the Americans and the Japanese launched their strike groups. Dozens of planes filled the sky, crossing paths somewhere over the Coral Sea, unseen by each other, racing toward destruction. The Japanese found the Lexington first. They came out of the clouds sleek, fast, and merciless. Dive bombers plunged toward the carrier, their bombs shrieking as they fell. The first explosion tore through the flight deck, the second sent fire racing across the hangar. The ship shuddered under the impact, alarms blaring as crewmen ran to battle stations. Smoke poured from every hatch, and the air grew thick with the smell of burning fuel. Despite the chaos, the gunners fought back fiercely. Anti-aircraft guns spat streams of fire into the sky, turning it into a deadly storm of tracers. Several Japanese planes were hit, bursting apart midair, their fragments raining into the sea. But the assault continued. One torpedo slammed into the Lexington's side, flooding the engine rooms. Another hit near the bow, knocking sailors off their feet. The ship began to list. Meanwhile, the Yorktown took heavy damage too. A bomb punched through her deck, detonating deep inside and killing dozens instantly. Yet somehow, she stayed afloat. Her crew worked like madmen, sealing compartments, dragging hoses, fighting fires that refused to die. From the sky, American pilots returned the favor, locating the Japanese carriers Shokaku and Ziwikaku and launching their counterattack. The scene in the sky was unlike anything seen before. Swarms of planes twisted and turned, bullets shredding clouds. The sun reflected off wings, blinding pilots for split seconds that meant life or death. The Shokaku took direct hits, explosions ripping across her deck, leaving it twisted and scarred. Smoke rose in thick columns as crewmen tried desperately to douse the flames. The Ziwikaku escaped major damage but lost most of its planes, its air group decimated. By noon, both sides were bleeding. The Lexington, though still afloat, was dying. Fires spread uncontrollably through her lower decks, reaching the fuel lines. Secondary explosions shook the ship from bow to stern. On board, Captain Frederick Sherman gave the hardest order of his life: abandon ship. Sailors jumped into the sea, some clutching life vests, others just holding on to whatever floated. The great carrier that had once ruled the Pacific now burned like a dying sun, flames devouring its proud hull. At 5 p.m., after rescuing as many men as they could, the Americans scuttled the Lexington. Torpedoes from a nearby destroyer struck her side, and moments later, she sank slowly beneath the waves. Over 200 men had gone with her, swallowed by the ocean that had been both their ally and their enemy. The rest watched in silence, their faces lit by the last glow of fire fading into dusk. When night returned, the Coral Sea was eerily quiet again. The smoke drifted away, and the waves rolled over the graves of ships and men alike. The Japanese had inflicted more damage, but their invasion of Port Moresby had failed. Their carriers were too damaged to continue, their aircraft lost in numbers they couldn't replace. Admiral Takagi turned his fleet northward, unaware that the Americans, battered but unbroken, would soon be waiting at a place called Midway. On the surviving carriers, the men were too tired to speak. They watched the horizon disappear into darkness, knowing the battle was over but the war far from won. Somewhere in that silence, they understood that they had witnessed the birth of a new kind of warfare, one fought not by battleships but by wings and courage. The Coral Sea still glowed faintly in the moonlight, its calm surface betraying the inferno it had just endured. The fires had burned out, the guns were quiet, but the memory of those 2 days would echo forever, a story written not in ink, but in smoke, salt, and blood. Aftermath and legacy. The sea was quiet again. Only days had passed since the last bomb fell over the Coral Sea, yet it already felt like another lifetime. The air still carried the faint scent of fuel and salt, the ghosts of battle drifting over waters that had turned strangely calm. Beneath those waves lay twisted wrecks and the bodies of men who had given everything. Above them, the sky stretched wide and empty, as if it too was trying to forget the noise, the smoke, the fire that had consumed it. For the survivors aboard the Yorktown, silence was the hardest part. The great carrier creaked as it sailed slowly through the gray water, its decks scarred and scorched. Sailors moved carefully, stepping over burned metal, their faces hollow from exhaustion. They had fought for days without rest, and now, for the first time, they could hear their own thoughts. Some leaned on the railings, staring at the ocean that had taken their friends. Others sat quietly in groups, passing around photographs of home mothers, wives, children, frozen in time, untouched by war. Messages from Pearl Harbor arrived one after another. The battle was over. Japan's advance toward Port Moresby had failed. The invasion fleet was turning back. The enemy had lost one carrier, another badly damaged, and many planes destroyed. But for the Americans, the victory felt heavy. They had lost the Lexington, and with it, hundreds of men. The ocean had taken its payment in full. Admiral Fletcher stood on the bridge of the Yorktown, watching the horizon. The sunset bled into the sea, a streak of red and gold stretching toward nothingness. He knew that this calm wouldn't last. The Japanese fleet was wounded, not destroyed. The war was only changing shape. "This isn't the end," he said quietly to his staff. "It's just the beginning of something bigger." His words, though soft, carried the weight of truth. Far away, in Tokyo, news of the Coral Sea reached the Imperial Naval Headquarters. The reports were mixed tactically, they had sunk an American carrier and damaged another. But the victory was hollow. The invasion of Port Moresby had been abandoned. For the first time in the Pacific War, Japan had been stopped. Admiral Takagi read the final dispatches in silence. The cost of success had been too high, experienced pilots gone, precious aircraft lost, and the morale of his men shaken. He closed his eyes for a moment, picturing the faces of those who would never return, then folded the paper neatly on his desk. Back in Washington, President Roosevelt received the same reports with a quiet sense of relief. It wasn't the triumph that would make headlines, but it was enough. After months of Japanese victories across the Pacific, the Allies finally had proved that the enemy could be resisted. America had stood its ground. The President sent a message to the fleet, * You have turned the tide of fear. The courage of your men will be remembered. *. In Australia, the news was greeted with tears and applause. People crowded around radios in small towns, listening to the announcer's trembling voice declare that the Japanese threat had been pushed back. Mothers hugged their children tighter that night, and soldiers training near the coast felt a surge of hope. For the first time, it seemed like the ocean would protect them again. But for those who had been there, who had seen the sky burning and the sea on fire, hope came slowly. Many of them carried memories that would never fade: the smell of burning oil, the screams of men in the water, the sight of a carrier slipping beneath the waves. The survivors of the Lexington were taken aboard other ships, wrapped in blankets, their eyes hollow. Some stared at the horizon without speaking. One young sailor, barely 19, whispered, "She went down fighting." Another nodded. So did they all. In the weeks that followed, the wreckage scattered across the Coral Sea became a silent monument. Schools of fish swam through broken steel, and corals began to grow over the remains of once mighty ships. Nature was reclaiming what war had stolen. But for those who commanded fleets and planned battles, the lessons of Coral Sea were already clear. The age of battleships was over. In just a few days, aircraft had rewritten the rules of naval warfare. No longer would ships trade shells within sight of each other. Now, the power belonged to whoever controlled the skies. The aircraft carrier had proven itself as the new ruler of the oceans. The generals and admirals of every nation took note. What happened in the Coral Sea was not just a battle, it was an evolution. Admiral Nimitz, studying reports in Pearl Harbor, saw the opportunity hidden inside the losses. He understood that Japan's carriers had been weakened, especially Shokaku and Ziwikaku. They would not be ready for combat for weeks. And in those weeks lay a chance, a trap to be set at a small atoll called Midway. The Coral Sea had been the opening act, the real turning point was yet to come. But away from strategy and plans, the human cost of the battle lingered. In small towns across America, telegrams arrived at quiet houses, carrying the same few words: "We regret to inform you." Families wept over folded flags and photographs in uniform. The war, once distant and heroic, now had faces, names, and empty chairs at dinner tables. For every victory, there was a price no map could measure. In Japan, too, sorrow moved through the cities. Families lit incense and prayed for sons who would never return. Some still believed in the empire's destiny, others just wanted the war to end. The Coral Sea had shown them that the enemy was stronger, more determined than they had imagined. For the first time, whispers began to spread among the ranks: perhaps Japan was not invincible after all. As months passed, the world barely paused to remember the battle. Bigger headlines came soon after: the Battle of Midway, the Guadalcanal Campaign, the march across the Pacific. Yet, in truth, the Coral Sea had changed everything. It was the first time Japan's expansion had been stopped, the first moment the Allies proved they could fight back and win strategically. It marked the beginning of a slow but unstoppable shift. Years later, when the war finally ended and peace returned to the oceans, veterans of the Coral Sea would look back on those days with a strange mix of pride and sorrow. They had seen horror, but they had also witnessed history being born. The ocean that had nearly taken them had also carried them into legend. And even now, beneath the waves, the remains of those ships still rest, silent witnesses to courage and sacrifice. The sea has long since healed, its surface calm again, but deep below, among the corals and sand, the echoes remain: the sound of engines, the thunder of bombs, and the voices of men who once fought to decide the fate of the Pacific. The Coral Sea will always keep its secrets, but its legacy endures in every carrier that sails today, in every pilot who takes off from a deck, and in every sailor who looks at the horizon knowing what it once cost to hold it. In the end, it wasn't just a battle, it was a beginning. The dawn of a new era, born out of fire, fear, and the unbreakable will of those who refuse to surrender.